Hey everyone, I'm recording this in April 2024. This will be my most in-depth tutorial to date on how to create this morphing animation effect in layers, starting from a Photoshop file, then FantaMorph, then compositing in After Effects. In this one, I go through 15 different animated features so you can see all the details and various ways of how I use this technique. I've previously done another tutorial with this technique that uses a flat image with only a few composite layers in After Effects. You can see that one on my YouTube channel, and I'll drop the link here in the description. Now let's dive in. Okay, first I think it's worth looking at why working in layers is beneficial versus a flat image. Now this was a really quick production done in another application called Corel Photo Mirage. And it can work really great, you can finesse it, but I just want to show the difference between, for example, if you look at the deer here, and all of the, even though I've masked out the deer, it's still morphing along the edge. I could put in anchor points, but basically you can see how everything's blending together and there's no separation between the layers. Now I use a lot of different metaphysical shapes and auras and layers that are transparent on top of the bottom foundational layer, and I want those animating at separate speeds and directions from other parts of the image, and so that's why I work in layers. So you can see what the project looks like in Corel Photo Mirage here, and it is a lot quicker to use when you're dropping in things like these directional arrows. You can just drop in the arrows, so it is beneficial in some circumstances to use this, but because, again, I'm so proficient with the other application, which is Abrosoft FantaMorph, this one here, and it allows me to work in layers. That's the one we're going with. Also, for exporting in layers, FantaMorph works a lot better. It's you can export in transparencies. It just gives you a lot more options, and the cost is relatively similar. So for FantaMorph, I use the deluxe version. It's $100. You don't need a subscription, and you can keep it like that forever. So that's, again, why we would want to look at it in layers. So before we get into the animation part, I want to take a look at the Photoshop file and how it's set up, how the layers are set up for animating. So as you can see in the layer view on the right hand side here, there's all this color coordination going on, and I've mapped out the colors according to an understanding that I have about how I want to do it. Typically the red layers are foundational layers that could just be added and built back up in After Effects later. They won't be animated, or they might become part of the background scene. Blue and violet are typically more etherical layers, and green is other features. So to get to the foundational layer, I am going to basically delete, rather turn off, all these other layers, except for the red layers, see how they look, and then I have to decide on what will be the base animation of this image. Okay, so you can see here I've stripped it down to almost entirely the foundational base painting layer, but there are a few layers on top. I actually might even just turn that one off. Basically, the idea is to get anything out of the way of what would be your foundational animation. So I have all these fractal lines on the trees, and those are going to be the direction that is going to be animated on the trees. And so I'll go through that process for each different layer type. Now I'm just going to jump to the folder to show you where I've already done that. So for example, here's a foundational layer where I've put directional arrows of where I want to animate. Now you can see there's a bit of difference between this one and this Photoshop, this version of Photoshop, and that's because I hadn't even actually done this one totally correctly. So sometimes after doing the arrows, I'll come back in and adjust it. And then you can see in this folder I'll just go through and you can see that I've separated a lot of the different layers and I've put directional arrows and some instructions of how I want to do it. Now anything on a black background like this will typically have a screen layer, meaning I can use the black background to my advantage for animating. It makes it a bit more easier to see, and then it will just be a screen blending mode in After Effects. Some of them have to have multiple output layers where there's actually an alpha layer and a black background layer, so I can see how to animate it. So for example, this one, you can see the checkerboard background that has an alpha channel to it. So when I get to animating that feature, it will make more sense. And also just note that you can see, it's kind of a bit hard to tell. I'll go back to the image, but there's actually extra around this, because what I've learned is to adapt for especially features that are along the edge. If I want them to continue animating off screen, you have to give more of a border. So you can see this hard line along the bottom. So I've actually cropped this out to have more border. I used to just do every single image as though it was the entire scene, but really that actually takes up a lot of extra space, especially with the animation output. This is a 5,000 pixel wide image, and it's good to start in the highest resolution possible. I'm just going to go back to that. Okay, so those ones there on the ground that I just turned on, see how they're on the edge? And then when I go back to this and I preview this, you can see again that that's on the edge. And I actually have a few different versions of it that I will be animating. So you have to export each layer in an understanding of how you're going to build the layers back up in After Effects. And again, this will make more sense as I go along. So now after checking out all the layers in Photoshop, I'm going to jump to the end of the project to show you what it looks like in After Effects with all the layers built up. And then as you're going through the animation, hopefully it will make more sense what the end point is actually going to be. So I originally often start off with a 2-second loop. And so this first composition in After Effects is 2 seconds. And then I pre-comp some of that and bring it into a 4-second loop. So some of the features are animating within a 4-second loop. And then in the end, I end up with an 8-second loop here. And that's just because some of the features are animating over an 8-second time period. Most of it's happening within the 2-second composition, and some of the features are brought into the 4-second one to be accentuated, or they're not even existing in the 2-second composition. So for example, here is, if I solo out, this is the background layer. This is the foundation that everything builds up on. And then you can see everything there. And then if I just slide along, you can see some of those features animating. Now, for example, in this 8-second comp, there's one feature that is animating over the whole 8 seconds, which is, I'm calling this the auras layer. Now, it doesn't include the auras of everything, but it's just some of the features, and that's what that looks like. So you can kind of imagine how that breaks down into the 4-second composition and the 2-second composition. It's all there. So, for example, you could see some of those in here. If I go to, let's see, if I solo out this layer, you can see one of those there. But in the 8-second composition, I'm just bringing more emphasis to it. So all the different layers are within this, and it starts off from the Photoshop composition. Now I'm going to go back into animating the very first layer, which is the foundational layer. I'm going to start there, and then I'll start to explain more about how this After Effects composition is built up as this tutorial goes along. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this Photoshop file now before we get into the animation aspect of it. So I'm at the foundational layer of where we'll start. And when I'm exporting files from the main layers document, I like to duplicate the document just so I don't save it and mess up the original. And then I will flatten this and I will save it as a high resolution JPEG and then bring that into Abrosoft FantaMorph. So now let's go into FantaMorph. I'm going to start from scratch. So when you get in, you're going to see this new project wizard. And I typically just bypass it and go to this little folder open on the left-hand side. I'm going to bring in this background image. And it says it's too large. Would you like to make it smaller? Yes, I would. And now this is just for the working file. So it's created this secondary image right beside the other one with a little S1 beside it. So now when I go to this second screen here on the right side, I'm going to go to the little folder open and bring in this image. Okay. So now how we start the image out, the best way to do it is to create all the anchor points for the places you don't want it to move first. And I start off by doing the perimeter of the image. And they can just be generally spaced, kind of how I'm doing it, along the edge. All right, so now we've got the perimeter there done. Now I'm going to go around and outline the trees because I know, based on, I'm going to go back to this directional reference, that's the main part of this foundational image that I'm going to animate. And you can see the spacing that I'm doing. It doesn't have to be super tight. It's generally enough to hold it together. So when you get to different features, like for example, I know I'm going to be animating these trees and then we've got these little conch mushrooms sticking out from the tree. So I just draw some anchors around them to make sure there will be no movement on those features. And it's important that you don't do any movement of the anchors until you're pretty sure that you have your whole image mapped out for movement. Otherwise, it will affect how the anchors are placed moving forward. So right here, I can kind of see some of the features bleeding off of the tree, so I'm going to go a bit to the outside of it and just keep moving along. Okay, so I've gone around and outlined most of the trees and the parts that I don't want it to move. Now I'm just gonna talk about this area here in the center. It's kind of has some blurry features, and this is just a subjective choice of how one wants it to move. I might just get the entire area to move because there's actually other things going on in the background. You can see these sort of, or in the foreground, I should say, you can see these other glowing dots here. And yeah, this place will probably just have a general upward movement. So on the one hand, I could outline the trees, or I might just experiment with dropping in a few dots and doing the general movement upward. Now, because I have, I'm going to outline this one, make sure that doesn't move there. Now, because I have already anchored in all the trees, I'm just going to leave that before I create any movement there. And then we have the water here. So same idea, I'm just anchoring around the edges of where I don't want any movement. There might be some little movement in there. Probably not too much. Anchor this rock. Anchor around these plants. Okay, so again, you can see I've anchored around the mushrooms, on the trees, and here at the bottom of the tree, because I know the movement's going to be on the tree, I've anchored at the bottom of the roots just to stop this foreground from moving. And I think that's overall looking pretty good. Yeah, so again, with the main anchors in place, now we can start experimenting with the movement. And because I already had the arrows done knowing where I want it to move, I can go into the patterns and start animating, or at least dropping anchors where I want the movement to be. So let's start with this big tree over here that has some of the more obvious pattern to it. I like my animations in this program to look really tight so that the features fit together as much as possible, which does take a bit of extra work, but that means dropping an anchor point on every sort of obvious feature within something like this line here. So I'll probably start on one side here and just start dropping these anchor points along that edge. And it gets a little weird down here, and we'll see what happens. That might end up being a bit experimental. There might be some back and forth playing with it. As you can see, I'm going to leave one blank one at the top. Also, I should actually put anchor points along here because that part's going to be moving a bit different. And this whole area, because of the curve, is going to move relatively the same. So again, I'll just drop some anchor points on these main features. Sometimes I might be going a little too tight, but I have found that it just generally looks better to go as tight as possible. And because this is all moving similar, I might just actually jump over all the way over to here and find some obvious features. And we'll see if we can get away with that. And again, the key thing about experimenting with movement is making sure that areas you don't want to move are blocked out before you start playing with the movement. So now, or I guess isolated would be another word to use. So now that area is pretty much isolated. I'm not going to experiment with the animation yet. I'm going to go into other areas and do the same thing. So the same as I did on that pattern, I'm going to do on some other patterns and work my way around. So for this one here on the left side, it's kind of funny how it works. Again, it's experimental. I'm going to drop anchors in this crevice here. So that's where I don't want it to move. I could probably get away with just one dot. Actually, that is really tight. So when it's super tight like this, you can kind of sometimes just skip one. And I'm only going to do one. And then when it gets wider, probably on this next one, I will start to do it along the edge because I'm going to do both edges. And then now I'm just going to come back to the middle of it. And that should work out. So now that that's isolated, I am going to just show you a little experiment of what that might look like animated without having done the rest of the image. I do think it's typically good advice to do as much of the image as possible before animating, but for the sake of this tutorial, so you can see what I'm talking about sooner than later, let's go over to the second screen, which is where the movement takes place. So you grab the arrow and move it to the next feature that you want it to be animated to. So it's just dropping in probably pretty hard to see. And if you're unsure if you've moved any of them, you can press Command or Control M, and on the bottom screen here, see how the red squares and yellow lines? Well, that'll show the movement. So for example, here I can grab this next one. Well, you can see on the bottom screen, you can see the movement. So you just want to match it to the similar feature there. Each dot at a time. Take the hand tool. Most of the quick keys are pretty similar to other apps. All right. Okay. So let's see now what that looks like animated. Oops. So in this on this side screen here, there's the different ways you can view it. There's auto reverse or loop. I usually just want it on loop. Yeah, so that's pretty good. It's pretty clean. Again, it's a bit of a low res image. This is lower res than high res, but than the full resolution image, I should say. But you can see that it's pretty clean. And that worked out pretty good. There's a few features that are a little not so great there, but because there will be so many other layers on top, it's okay to leave that. Great, so now I'm going to go through and do the rest of the image. Best fit, again, we can see all the dots building up. Yeah. And now I'm going to go through and do the same thing on all those fractal patterns. Okay, so as I'm going along here, getting some interesting areas, there's this sort of overlap of textures here, and it may or may not look good animated, but I'm going to isolate, go in this little crack here, and isolate this zone. It's isolated along that edge, it's isolated along this edge. Might make this a little tighter here. And what I have done, I'm going to get rid of those ones, is I've put anchor points because this is a much bigger pattern. So I've put anchor points on each one of them because the bigger the gap, the harder it is to fill in the space. Unlike this small one up here, it was a bit smaller of gaps, smaller features. So I could go every other fractal feature there. That's what I call those. And so since this has another pattern going another way, I'm not really going to create any isolation right in between because it might be fine for this whole area to move sort of together. So I'm going to drop anchor points along the edges of this pattern and then just start going up the middle, and let's see what happens when we animate it. So coming over to the screen and moving this up to there. I usually like to start at the top of the direction that it's going. And some of these ones with the bigger movements, they don't end up looking really all that great when they're animated. But we'll see. And you just have to play around a little bit. And look at that window below, and you can kind of see how there's like a bit of a transparency. Now that has to do with wherever the slider is, this slider. So if it's in the middle, you're going to see transparency on either end. It's going to be opaque and you're going to see the final animation. So it's good to have it working in the middle. And then you can see, okay, I'm moving that. And you'll see like, oh, it does kind of line up with that edge. Because the computer, however it's working, is looking for similar information to be able to map itself and fill in the blanks. Anyway, so let's see what that looks like. You can see it's pretty fast moving compared to the smaller animation, and we might want to control that later. I'm not sure. Sometimes I just have to come back in and edit images, and it really depends on how the rest of the layers go. Each image is a bit different in how it reads as the final animation with all of the layers. So I'm just going to leave that as it is. And I like having different speeds of animation. You'll see that when I get to the After Effects, that I like to have exports of different speeds. So we'll pause that, and I'm going to keep working and come back to any areas of interest. Okay, so now if you look at the bottom window, you can see that I have most of this tree animated. I'll zoom in a little bit more. And it's looking pretty tight. All the features more or less are fitting together. So in contrast, I'm going to move over to this next tree on the right side of this one and show you what it would look like if you had a bit more sloppy, or you just weren't as tight with the anchor points. Because I know that this tree's already isolated, it can see the anchor points around the edges. If I knew that the movement was going up and I didn't really care that much about those lines being super tight and fitting together, I could just drop in some loose anchor points and just, put on the bottom screen, and see on the bottom, I can kind of see the length of the yellow line. That's the length of the movement. So I would just kind of design a movement that would have a similar, each anchor point that moves is going to have a similar duration there. So let's see what that looks like. So compared to the one on the left, you can see on the left, all those little features they're meeting up with the next one in the sequence, whereas the one on the right, it's really blocky. It's just not really working out. And that can be fine for some other elements. Like I might get to that with the water, but that's not what I'm doing with the trees. So I'm just going to undo that and just undo like any other application. Get rid of those anchor points. Make sure we're good. Okay, there's no movement on that right tree. Now we'll jump back into doing it properly. All right, so now I've done, if you look in the bottom screen here, you can see I've done all the main features inside the trees that I want to animate. And if you remember, I said I was going to come back to this area in the middle, see what we're going to do about it, because it's a bit more kind of free form. So we're going to experiment with what that looks like to not really have to do every single feature. So I will mark those main areas, and you can kind of see these ripples in the background. So again, I'm just flowing upwards with that. And the idea to create some kind of consistency, I actually don't even need this middle one. It's almost like just grab, maybe even like, we'll sort of just go 3 across at a similar distance and see, well, yeah, see, I don't want to animate this area where the tree leaf is. That'll look weird, but we can go up to that point and then just animate those other ones. So let's see what happens now when I move over to this right screen and just go. I'm gonna do the Command M so I can also at the same time see on the bottom screen, making sure I'm getting similar movement. This is totally in the background. It might even be, sometimes it happens where I animate features that I mask them out in After Effects because it's too much. But you don't know until you do it. All right. Oh, let's see now what that looks like. It's not bad. It's a pretty fast movement. Let's see. Zoom out. Yeah. I think that's all right. Again, yeah, no, I think actually, I think I would lessen that a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up and just back those off a little bit. So just so that there's a bit less movement. And again, I'm looking at the bottom screen. Could also just, since these are together, just grab this whole group actually, just select around them and move them together. And then these ones on the edge. Yeah, that's a little better. I think I'm missing some of those dots. Kind of glowing dots on the above the spring. Oops. So now that I have created movement, if I go back to the left top screen, if I drop in some anchor points over there, sometimes they will have moved, but because they're so close to another solid line of anchor points, they stayed pretty stationary. So we'll just give them a little bit of movement. And there we go. That's good enough. There's going to be lots of other layers, so don't need to go too crazy. So now I'm going to deal with the creek here. And there's parts where it's almost pointless. Like it's kind of just more where the highlights are. A little bit of these ripples going out. And you can see I've isolated the other features that aren't going to be animated. I'll see what that looks like. Yeah, that's good. There's just a little bit of movement there. Sometimes I add some other elements to the water in After Effects to just make it look a bit more like water. And I think this foundational image is done. There's a few other areas that I might adjust when I bring it into the main project. But it's good. All right, so now I will export it. Save it first. And export. Okay, so before we do that, remember we had put in the low resolution image, so I want to make sure to come back to the high resolution. Now when it asks this, I'm going to say no. Bring in the high resolution. No. I'm going to save that. And now the movie size, make sure it's the same as image 1. Go up to movie length. And I'm going to make it 30. And see, now when I preview that, it moves a lot slower. That's just how this is set up, but it'll be faster in After Effects. You will see. So that's about it's a 1 second loop. And we can go maximum quality. Don't need 32-bit image for this. And image sequence. All right, that's good to go. Creating a new folder for renders. Okay. Now you have to create a folder. Let's name this project background 2. And now I'm going to make sure to change this to JPEG. It was on BMP. And now after the title, I'm going to put another underscore because it's going to number all the frames. Make sure I'm in this folder. And that way, if you have the file delineated by a number, then the output will have its separate numbers after the underscore. And there we go. We have the 30 frames. Now you'll find that you can sometimes do without one of these frames. In fact, when I make the loops, we'll end up eliminating one. I'll explain that more later, but you actually just need from 1 to 29. But that's good for this tutorial on the foundation. and we'll get to some other layers next. Okay, so now moving on to the second part of this foundational building process, I'm going to start bringing layers into After Effects. So I'm going to grab the main Photoshop file that I showed earlier, bring it in as a composition, merge layer styles into footage, and there it is. So if I open that composition, all of the layers are there. So they're not colored like they were in the original, or like they are in the original Photoshop file. So I'm going to just go back to the original version of this, and we can see in After Effects, it's all there. And this is a good place to start with building the animation. So I'm going to change this to, I'm going to change some settings. Okay, so now that I have the layers in here, what I'm going to do is actually just duplicate this composition, and I'm going to call it Sequence 1. I'm going to open that, and I know that it's usually good to have it be 2 seconds for the foundational layer. So I might even put that 2 seconds in the title. Now what I'll do with this one is I'll go through and either start turning off or getting rid of certain layers that I don't need, but I don't really need to do that exactly yet. Since I've created a rendering of the foundation, I'm gonna call this, I'm gonna make a new folder here in the folder bin and call it Morphs. And that's where I will import the other morphing animations. Make sure the sequence, JPEG sequence, is turned on. Now I did delete the last frame because this is something that I'm experimenting with. Is usually I end up overlapping by a single frame, so I figure I might as well just delete one of the frames because the first and the last frame are repeated in the output. All right, so that's 2 seconds long, and I know that it's 2 seconds because now I'll duplicate that, go to the out, and there we go. So obviously you can see it ends up becoming just a little bit shorter, but that's okay, it works out because sometimes I create a loop that's about 8 seconds long. That's kind of average. It's anywhere from 4 to 8 seconds with other features that are animated, but the first foundational layer is usually 2 seconds. All right, so it's hard to tell, but you can see some of the background layer animating. Now, of course, we want to get all those other features, but it's not a bad idea to have them in here. I could go through and color code them. It's fine. I don't need to, because we have the original Photoshop layer to reference. I'll have that open at the same time. As you can see also, it'll show us the blending modes that I'm using and just the outline of the layers. And of course the composition has retained the same size, 48,000 pixels wide. Like I said, I'm usually around 5,000 or 4,500 to 5,000. And then we can shrink it down. So I'm going to save that. Now, when I'm creating the other animations, we can bring them in and start stacking them. Okay, here we have another layer of this project. It's a relatively simple geometric layer, so following the lines to get them to move together is pretty straightforward because there's a lot of defined markers on these geometries. So as you can see, I've already sectioned off, I've isolated one area, I've created a wall between it and the other ones. I don't need to pin around the edges of this one. It already has an extra frame. It's meaning it's bigger. I saved it larger than the foundational layer so that it can animate going off the edge of the screen without squishing up to the edge. Now, I'm just going to play the animation. So if you look at the bottom screen, you can see it moving. It's pretty quick because the shapes are really far apart. So how this is mapped out is choosing very specific features within this geometry. So see around the diamond, the central diamond, there's 4 anchors, and then I match it up to the next one. And then I chose these 3 spots in this triangle, and then the lower triangle with the peak there, and then just moved it up to the following in the chain there. So zoomed in close up of the animation. You can see it flowing pretty good, and you can see the top one is getting squished, but it's going to be going off frame anyway, and that's why I've been giving myself now extra border to work with on these. So I'm just going to drop some markers on another one so you can see what that actually looks like in the process of doing it. So I will leave, so just start at the top here. Do the same thing, choose these specific spots, and work my way along all of them. Now, another thing actually I want to point out is that I don't really need to isolate between these ones because they're all going to flow in the same direction. So I don't need to spend the time isolating, creating points where it's going to stop. There's some other geometries where you want to do that, but this one not so much. So now I'm just going to keep putting these anchors in. All right, so now that I've got this all mapped out, I'm going to animate some more of them, and there is a little bit of a quicker method sometimes by selecting areas, especially when the patterns match quite a bit. I'm going to do one line at a time here and show you what that could look like. Oops. Let's go with this red one here. And I'm just going to grab this section and move it up to an imaginary space where I know that final dot should be basically at the peak. Now this one, I'm going to move it up, but you can see that, well, because the one below it was smaller, I'm going to just make some adjustments to put it at the correct spots, more or less there. Same thing with this one. And then I have to make the adjustments. So obviously there will be others where it might work out a little better, but it's still kind of quicker than moving each one separately. Really just depends on how many adjustments you have to do, little tweaks like that. That's one way to do it, and can be a time saver. And let's zoom in. What happened there? There is one. So I can either spend a lot of time troubleshooting that, or I can just sort of move along and see what it looks like in the project. Give a little preview of that section. Yeah, so it's all squished here because the bottom wasn't moving, but you can see that it's doing the same effect as was shown in the original. It's just sometimes those features on the edges have weird glitches like that, but we'll see what it looks like in the project. So I'll finish animating this and bring it into the project. Okay, now we have mapped it all out and we've got everything animating. Oops, except for one little area over here. All right. It's looking pretty smooth. So now for the export, again, I got to go back to this original file and import the large high resolution image. Okay. And as far as, so yeah, go back to size, make sure it's the same size and length. Now this one I am going to do at 60 frames. So it basically comes out at 2 seconds because I know I'm going to end up using that. I think that this, because it's moving so quickly, I will want to slow it down. Now I can do frame blending on After Effects and it doesn't work as well. For the sake of this, let's do an experiment and see which one looks better. Because again, some features look okay with frame blending, some don't. Okay, now we have this dropped into the After Effects project. I brought in both the 30-second and the 30 frames and 60 frames deleting the last frames of both. And there's different ways to actually extend the frames of this. I've done a time remap of the 30 frames per second one, and it's the orange one here. Now when I drop this layer in, because it had an extra border, I do want to make sure that it lines up to the original, and it should be no problem because I extended the border the same on every side. So I'm just at the first frame here and turning on and off the original, and yeah, it matches up perfectly. And I think actually in this case, just a time remap with some blending of the frames, frame blending is turned on, it actually looks pretty good. I can't notice anything bad going on there. I noticed that it didn't even look too bad without the frame blending. It's a little smoother. It's all kind of pretty subtle with the frame blending on. And then the 60 frames per second one, again, it's appearing to my eyes to be a bit better. It's just overall a little bit smoother. So you can see what that looks like, and we've got it looping in this 2-second clip, and you can kind of see actually, just comparison, it's still actually moving pretty quick compared to the features on the tree, even though they were actually only 30 frames per second and are on a 1-second loop. So that's interesting. Let's see what just happens. Also, time reverse this layer. I actually had originally mapped this going down because I think I'm going to have some of the other features going up. And sometimes that looks cool. Sometimes it just starts to look super weird. But it's easy enough to switch it back and forth. There you have it. There's one more layer to this project. Okay, let's have a look at this next layer. This is a radial piece. It's going on the ground, and it was exported. You can see where there's this hard line on the bottom of it. I'm in the top left window here. There's a hard edge there. That's actually the edge of the frame of the picture, and I exported this to have significant extra boundary so that when it's animated, the animation bleeds nicely off the edge of the frame, so there's no bunching on the edge of the frame. And these ones, I put the anchors really tight. I'm usually actually doing it from a little further away, but basically in between each circle. It's kind of an easier marker. You could do something where you do like one on either end. Sometimes I've done all 4 sides, but I found that this works pretty well. I haven't found it to work as well if I just try and drop one in the center of each circle. There needs to be a bit more for it to grab onto. So yeah, right down to the center of the circle. Now let's see what it looks like animated. Pretty good. It's looking pretty tight, and I'm happy with that. You can see it going off the bottom of the screen here. That little glitch is fine because that's off frame. So the thing about this one is that it has an alpha channel, so it's actually not a screen layer. Sometimes these ones are, sometimes they're not. This one has an alpha channel, so I'm going to bring that in. There's 2. One's... I see. Okay. It's probably because one's a screen layer. Yeah, okay. So let's go into the After Effects and see. Okay. Yes. One is a screen, and one is just normal. So that's... sometimes I might combine them and output it because the screen one is on top. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, first, since we have this alpha layer in here, I'm going to show you how to export with the alpha channel intact. So we got movie size, same as 1, length. We're going to go 30 on this. I think that these usually look good at 1 second loops. Now, save it. And when I go to export, you got to go export as 32-bit image. And then we'll make a folder. Score. Now here's where it's important to get the alpha channel. It has to be a BMP. Otherwise it won't read the alpha channel. So let's export that. We'll bring it into After Effects. Okay, we've got this ground rad 1B. That will go. Put it on top of those other ones. And now we need to make sure we get it to the right spot. So let's just isolate those. Isolate just this one. Okay. Looking good? Yeah. Look at that. Awesome. Okay, now let's try exporting both layers combined and screening it on to see how that looks. Because it might end up looking all right. Got to play with these things. Like I said, each image kind of has different qualities. For a lot of these features, like if I were to do, depending on what it is, I would do a PNG export. Like that's what I do from After Effects. Seems to retain high resolution. But for a lot of these features that are being stitched together in After Effects, JPEG seems to be the lowest size, file size. Might not be best for archiving, but in the end, it's been looking good. I've been doing it for a while, actually for many years with all of these, and I think it looks good. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, now I hold down Alt and drag it onto those. So it just changes the file. So these have to be selected, and this one up here has to be selected. Hold down Alt and then drag it on top of the ones you want to swap with and see how the file name has changed. Now I'm going to screen that and turn off these and just see how it looks. Yeah, that actually looks pretty good. It's a little different looking, but overall pretty good. And yeah, kind of nicer again sometimes to not have to deal with as many layers or as many exports. Sometimes when I'm going to delete those, render this in the background while I show you my files. Sometimes when I'm exporting the files, like this one, how I have the different versions of it with the alpha channels, because this was in fact 2 layers on the original painting, and then there's this flattened one. So anytime I do an alpha channel one, there should be a flat one with a black or dark gray background. Usually black, because that's just the best for doing a screen layer or anything else like that. But it's good to do them all the same, all at once. So they're the exact same file, or the document size here is exactly the same, the dimensions of it. So that if I did need to use them, I don't have to go back in and try and line them up. I like to have some features, I take them off the original image at the same time. So that can be helpful. Now let's see what this render looks like. Let's go full screen. Yeah, looking pretty good there. And I did decide to go with the 60 frames per second on the diamond pattern here that's also moving upward. I felt like in the end, when I went to high resolution, it does just look crisper. So I'm going to stick with that. And let's check out another layer. Now let's dive into something more complex. These are kind of more the most complex feature of my animations. I usually use hexagons in all the images. And this one's going to be a doozy. So just going to reference the flow file. Yeah, of course, usually I have these flowing up, but some of these are kind of going sideways, but they're all generally the same direction. So these do take a little bit more work. Now, I've got it open here. No anchors yet. And again, I also exported this with an extra border frame so that when it goes onto the main scene, because this actually fills the entire frame, that the animation is moving off the screen. I can see that this section right here is probably going to be the most straightforward. I'm going to isolate this and drop in the anchors and just show you this one section. All right, so I've got some of the anchors dropped into this, and you can see here that what I did was I dropped them more or less into the in-between spaces. It's a little sloppy in spots, but it'll work out. But it's basically just sort of in between, so sort of really top, bottom, all sides. Oh, let's get one in there too. So basically, because we want to match all of the 6 sides to the next one, and because this is going, it's kind of weird, the hexagons, because see how it's like an overlapped shape unlike the other pattern. So we kind of just have to decide which way it's going to go. Like, even though it's going up, it's actually going to go kind of slightly diagonal. So I'm going to grab this first top row and just move it all together, since it's relatively the same size up here. And oh, it's a little risky with nothing up here. We'll see what happens. Something like that. And then take note. So this next row are at the bottom. So I'm going to grab these next ones. And essentially I'm keeping my eye on one of them and realizing, okay, it has to go up to there. It has to go up to that same spot, but diagonally. Okay. Now I'm just going to check to see. Oh yeah, see, look at this mistake. Look at that, what's even happening? Brutal. It's going backwards. I moved it in the top left window. Wrong. Okay, undo, undo, undo. Okay, that's a quick undo. Let's go over here and try that again. Okay, this one. I'm going to keep my eye on. I'm going to do this one right there. And it's going to this spot, basically. Right there. Okay. Bottom ones. Let's go. Bam. And that's pretty good. Not bad. With the alignment, it starts to get a little weird when there's some missing, but it's, again, you kind of just keep your eye on one and then move the rest. Like this, okay, bottom left corner of this needs to basically go to the bottom left corner of that. Okay. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Let's zoom out. Yeah, let's go in a little closer to that. And since I've already isolated this one, you can see I drew a isolation wall around this, and the one below it has already been mapped out, so it's not going to be affected if I... So you can see how the hexagons are blending right into each other. And if I just did it going straight up or some other direction, it would be blurry. So you're just mapping it from one hexagon to the next. Now let's keep going with these, and if I encounter any other difficult areas, I'll show you what that looks like. Like, see here, there's these overlapping ones. It's really just about choosing which way for it to go. And with these, again, if it's kind of, if there's a lot of different sizes and such, I sometimes might isolate between them within this black space. And it's generally a bit of a trial and error as I go along with the project. Hey, so I'm working on another section of these hexagons, and I'm noticing that these ones are all relatively a similar size. So let's see what happens when I grab them as a chunk and move it rather than all of them individually. It gets a little small over here. Got to find one point. Let's take this bottom left, that guy there, and match it to that bottom left. All right. Yeah, there's a few off over here, so we'll just kind of straighten those out. Let's give it a little test here. Yeah, it's a little weird. So it's this section. I'm looking at the preview animation window now. What happened is because the one above it was moving a bit more horizontally, they're clashing in the middle. Some of those things are hard to avoid. I should have probably gone a little bit more up on the other one. So I'm just going to undo that. But it did work pretty well for that section. So what I can do is actually undo. All right. The one above it I had done the same. So we want to go up and over. And it's a little tricky the way these ones are laid out. Yeah. Because they're pointing at a different angle. So it's like, if I only bring it, it can only go so far. So see, yeah, it was kind of going sideways there. Things are going sideways. Could also just knock out that one so it's not gripping so much. And like that. See? It's all right. Now, it's almost too tight to isolate between them here. So make sure we have a good marker here. I'm going to go, I guess this one I could go entirely sideways also. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, there we go. So see, that's matching a bit. But do I really want it to go that way? I have to go back to the original image and check out where those are. So that is in the, yeah, that could work all right. That's in the bottom left corner here of the tree. So it'd kind of be going away sideways. That could be all right. Have a little difference rather than on all of them going exactly up. Yeah, I think I'll leave it. They're looking pretty good. And that's the thing about these hexagons. Like I said, they're a little funky. So as you can see in the window on the, let's look at this on the top left here. I've isolated out this section so I can test it out. Each section that I'm testing, I've isolated out. And those are the only ones I've done so far. Even though I've already put the anchor points on the one below these animated ones just to make sure. I could have drawn some isolation points between, but also just making sure that sections are anchored is another way to do it. Sometimes the isolation is helpful in other circumstances. But that's looking good. I'll keep on this and we'll see what's next. All right, so we got the section below what I just did, and just grabbed chunks. So gonna just reverse it and then show you. So I grabbed that top chunk and moved it. Grabbed this other chunk, moved them. They're not totally exactly aligned up here, but there's a lot of blank space, so I'm not going to be finicky with it. And grabbed that bottom chunk and moved it. So So that's looking pretty clean. It's kind of going up and to the diagonal. This one here, there's this next one down here, there's a lot of invisible sections. And I think I generally want it to go up. And this is a little easier the way these hexagons came out, the lines on them. It's sort of like the meeting points. See on the one to the left here where my arrow is, they kind of have like the vertical points going up and down, and this one, it's kind of rotated. So I'm just gonna, grab that chunk and just go up with it and see what that looks like in the preview window down below. Looks pretty good, I would say. And this next section down here, a little messier, but we can see that a lot of these, again, similar size. So I'll grab this section and go up. Basically, it's kind of just following the natural direction of them. So let's see what that section looks like. Yeah. Well, there's a weird little glitch kind of where it joins this other one. So what we could do to finesse that, because they are moving in slightly different, I could try moving this one just straight up also. Okay, a bit to the side. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, see, that does flow a little bit better into that. So now I will move the rest of these in this section similar to that, but you can see it's a little wonky. There's different sizes, so I'm probably going to do each of these individually. Moving on. And we're back. Look at this glorious display of anchors and anchors and more anchors. And let's add some movement. Check out that preview screen down below. All those hexagons are... I keep doing that with the magnification wheel. They are aligning. They are merging. There's some areas here where they're overlapping. Like, see this messy cluster kind of right here in the middle. But it worked out. And I was doing a lot of them in chunks. You can see what these look like. It's looking pretty good. So, you can see, if I'm going to go back out here, there's not a lot of separation lines. Once I had the momentum with it, I just started anchoring in all of those in-between points on the hexagons, and then eventually just going for it with the animation. There's not a lot of divisions or isolation. So that's all good. Let's see. And export just as a regular JPEG because it's on a black background and I already know that this is a screen layer. So I will export as is and see it back in the After Effects file. And here we are back in After Effects. I've brought the hexagonal layer in. And if you're able to have a close look compared to some of the other patterns, it is moving slower. I have it at the 60 frames per second, so it's running on 2 seconds. And I like that. It gives a bit of difference with overlapping metaphysical layers, so some are moving faster than others. And it looks good, so moving on. All right, so here we have one of the more complex structures. This is a pattern that kind of goes all over the place. So here it is on the center of the screen. And now here is the directional arrows. So if I go back to this one, you can see these rippling patterns, and I generally try to follow some kind of direction that it's either rippling out or inwards. And it gets a little kind of complicated doing the animation. I'm going to just show you what the animation looks like. Let's zoom in here. So here you can kind of see just the smooth rippling pattern. Let's change the duration so you can see it moving faster. There you go. So it's not super accurate. There's some areas like over here where it's kind of on the left side. It's a little squished, but again, it kind of just depends how it's going to be in the image. Some things like this don't have to be perfect, and it has enough of a rippling effect. That is what the shape is after all. So you can see in the pattern of how I've done it, in the smaller ones, there's not a lot. I've kind of just taken an inner line and an outer line and then put an anchor in the center of it and not moved that. And then you can see the results in the animation screen down below. And if you look from the left screen at the top to the right screen, you can see there's not a lot of anchor points. Whereas if I go to some of the larger ones, like kind of right beside it here, there's basically 4 rows. Sometimes I'll end up doing 4 or 5. It kind of depends how it starts. So this is sort of a maze, and I follow my way around, and some lines meet up closer to the center of another one. But again, you might not be working with this pattern. This is just an example of how to work with different patterns within a project or shapes and animate them with this technique. So I'm going to show you what that looks like in the After Effects project when it's stacked with everything else. So if you focus on some areas like maybe around here, you can see some of those rippling patterns better, maybe here. But there's so much going on, it's blended in there quite well. And any of the little errors, they don't show up. So that's what that looks like. And you can experiment. Just another way to experiment with however you want to do your own shapes. Okay, so we have a new texture here, and I'm halfway through animating it. I've already laid in most of the anchors, and so I'm halfway across and want to show you what's happening. You can see on the left-hand side that the larger sections of the pattern look like they're moving faster, and the ones closer to the interior look like they're moving a lot slower, and that's just their spatial relationship to each other and the way this works, because they're all in the same scene. It's kind of like parallax or something like that. And so when I zoom in, this center part, you might notice, probably hard to tell from there, but there's a little bit of drag when you have like a big pattern next to a small one. The big one will kind of drag little bits of the small one. But that's all right here. It's hardly noticeable. And there's not much you can do about it. You wouldn't want to isolate these from each other like I've done in others where, let's look at this top screen. I did it right here because one of them was moving in a different direction, like drawing a line of anchors between them, because they're so close together and they're moving the same direction, so there's not really much point in isolating them with a wall of anchors, because then it will actually create more drag. So what I did with some of the bigger patterns here, because it looks kind of similar to one of the patterns I was working on before, but it is a bit different. And on the bigger sections, I've drawn anchors around all 4 sides of the inner diamond and then all 4 sides of this bigger diamond. Nothing in between, just getting the main shape. And then on the smaller sections, I'm only dropping a dot or an anchor in the middle of the diamond, because it's really enough. These are actually pretty, when we zoom out, they're pretty small, so it just needs enough information to meet up there. And so now as I'm animating these, because there is also a difference in width from the top to the bottom on a lot of them, I'm just grabbing one section at a time and pulling it up and then making adjustments. That one's just going into nowhere, so I don't really need to. That one needs to be a bit smaller. Another way I can do it, since it's a fairly equal shape, is just grab the corners and shrink it. There we go. Because it's not really going to work. They're different enough that I can't just grab a whole section and move them together. Unless there's some parts, like I'm getting to down here, where they're probably close enough. I can already see, though, that this one is a little... So let's see what happens. Let's see when I drag these three. Yeah, it's enough off that it just makes sense. It's just as efficient to do it one at a time here and make adjustments as needed. So that's it for tips on this particular image. It's pretty similar to other ones. And we'll keep plugging away at the rest of the animation. Now here is yet another layer of patterns of aura energy along the trees. So this one here, when we go into the project, I'm going to show you that while often I'm mapping to match the pattern of the next section moving up the chain, this one I didn't move a full section because it would be too far. So if you kind of look at like this node here, it's actually just going up to that one. So it does kind of go up a section, but it's because this pattern actually changes a bit as it moves along. It doesn't look bad. I kind of like this one actually to have more of a... So let's zoom in to see what I'm... So it has sort of just more of a... This one does get a bit more blurred, which often I'm trying to avoid, but this one I happen to like how that looks, and I think it works well with this specific pattern. So again, just another example. And also a reminder that once you start dropping anchors or nodes onto these features, you don't really need to build separation walls between them. It's only, let's say you want to do one and then test it out, you might want to put like a separation wall. What I mean by that, again, is just doing something like this where you're dropping anchors between. So you want to do one section, animate it, test it out, make sure that the motion isn't going to affect any of the other ones, and then you can do the other ones after. And again, you'll notice that with a lot of these patterns that are screen layers on a black background, I'm not having to anchor in the edges because it's going to be screened. That's more for flat objects. Moving on. Now coming in, you can see how that pattern looks along with the other ones mixed in. It blends in nicely. There's a lot going on. Hard to even see it. Let me see if I zoom in to this area. Maybe you'll notice it a bit more. That's all right. That's how some of these things work. There's a lot of overlapping layers. And that's how it's done. So we've been looking at a lot of patterns that have a lot of tight anchor points. So what about something more organic like smoke? So I'm going to take a look at this layer and show you a really simple way that you can do something like this. If you don't want to get too fancy with mapping it all out, you can just drop in some anchor points. I only got six throughout the whole painting, and then I'm going to select them all together and move them up on the right side of the screen. And let's check out what that looks like. So it's not bad. It might be too much movement. We might want a bit of variation in some of there, but let's see what it looks like in the project, because that just might be enough for something like this. Okay, so here we are in the project, and I think that looks all right to me. In fact, I can barely even see where that layer was. Most of it was really blurred out anyway, so we kind of just have this slightly moving purple aura throughout it. In the front left corner here, there was some that was a little bit more defined, and I did it at 2-second loop, so it is moving a bit slower. There's a couple other smoke layers, we'll do the same. But yeah, I think that's good. So it's nice to know that sometimes you don't need to do all the same kind of tight work that you're doing with the patterns. You can just do something simple like a few anchor points throughout the image. And now here is another smoke layer, some organic shapes, but I am gonna do something a little different than the last one. We're gonna add a bit more direction to this spot on the right. So what that could look like is I'm gonna have some of it going the direction going outwards and to the right, and some going to the left. And I don't really need to drop an anchor point right in the middle, but with these radial curvy ones, I'll just drop some anchor points in a few spots along the radial points. Obviously in here it's just a kind of mess of stuff, so I don't really need to think about that too much. It will just do what it does once we move these anchor points in here. And on this side, it's not as necessary to do much specific work there. I'm just going to let it flow. Drops a couple on the bottom. And right there. Okay, so now for the motion. I'm going to pull these ones out to make it look like it has an expanding effect on these curves. All right, so you can see what that's doing there. Just a little bit of a different direction, but again, not necessarily needing to be as tight as the patterns. And here we are back in the project. And again, it's blending in nicely. This layer I ended up adding a little bit. Added a second layer, a duplicate of it, with the transparency set to 50%. It kind of disappeared, and that sometimes does happen with the screen layers, especially once you start adding motion. They just, if they're really translucent, they kind of disappear. So sometimes I'll just duplicate a layer and vary the opacity, maybe even do a different effect, like an add blending mode, and see what that looks like. Because some of these features just look different, of course, in the animation than they do in the static painting. So it's interesting to play with that and see what the overall effect looks like in the end. Now let's have a look at these layers around the deer. We've got some radials coming up from around it. I'm going to turn them off here so you can see what we're working with. Okay, so there's a small one right around the head, and then a larger one. See that? Turn it off. Can barely see the small one. So they are two different layers, and they have different blending modes. So when I built the file for animating, because they're basically on the same axis, I made one layer flattened to animate the entire thing so that it would have the same flow to it, but I will export them separately. So we'll just preview the animation here. And if you look at the anchors, I actually on this one just went every other spoke of the wheel, and it's working out all right. Sometimes you might want a tighter look. I find sometimes with this feature, with the dots, rather than the inverse of these spikes, it actually works better to have anchors on every spoke. It kind of just depends on where the feature is. Anyway, so what I will do is export them separately. That's the point of this, is to show that you can make a file that you know you're going to use for multiple things. So I'm gonna import, just make sure this is saved. I'm going to import the file that is for the smaller centerpiece of this. And you can see, all right, that's working out. And that's going to be a screen layer. And like I described before, when I export them from the original Photoshop file, I make sure to do it at the exact same document size if it is cropped from the original document, so that when I place them in the After Effects file, they'll be exactly the same. So let's see what it looks like in the project. And here we are back, and we have all those radials synced up coming out from the aura around the deer. Looking good. On to the next. Okay, so now we have another radial feature, but it's not the same as the other one we were working on, because not all of the points of it are in complete alignment. The other one had circles that were exactly one after the other in a sequence. This has triangles that are actually in a rotation. So what I've done is dropped anchors on all the in-between points in the triangle. And there's a few ways to execute this, how to animate it. I'm going to show you what the animation looks like. Let's go, just make sure it's big there. So it's got this rotation. It's a little blurry. The center's a little off. And that's because rather than moving each individual anchor, I was attempting to just grab the whole thing and rotate and scale it. So if I just press undo, you can kind of see my moves there. I'm moving it around because I scaled it, rotated it. Okay. First started, there we go. So first started with a rotation, which you want to grab them all and go to Edit, Transform, Rotate, or Control R. For some reason, it'll grab the other screen, but just click on this screen and come back, and these little rotation arrows will appear on it. So this part's easy. So just rotate. If the center axis is a little bit off, it won't line up exactly, but pretty close. So if I press play, you can see, all right, it's growing a little bit, kind of blurry, but it's rotating. So that's cool. Could just leave it there, but I do like it when it expands one time also. So if I hold down Shift, Control, Alt, and grab the transform arrows, I can scale it up. But now you can see, oh, now it's out of whack again. But I'll just get the dots to the next line where they will join up. And then I'll rotate it again. I sometimes like to get on this feature too. This is in the tools. Actually, sorry, no, it's to view triangles. So Control T. And then you can see all the triangles. And now, because this is triangles, it'll help me match it up a bit better. So I'm going to try and rotate it again and see what happens. I can see some of them are kind of aligning over here, but then this is all crazy up here. So just kind of try and play around with it and see if I can get it pretty close to be in alignment. Might have to scale it down. It looks like It's a little big. So we'll go edit, transform, scale. Just tweak that. And move it. Nope, I don't like that. Let's see what it looks like anyway. It's cool. Sometimes it might not be as off as we think just by looking at those triangles. Oh yeah, see, that's not too bad. It's kind of more or less like the one that I showed before. So it almost just looks like it has a bit of motion blur to it. And I think it's good enough because there's always going to be a little bit of blur with this type of animation. That's just how it works when it's trying to match the first frame to the last frame. Obviously that's not true. There's not always going to be a bit of blur. What I should say is that there can be blur and you can use it to your advantage or just be fine with it, however you want to do it. What I like to do sometimes is just execute something and then export it, take it into the project and see what it'll look like there. Now I know that this one had an alpha channel, so I'm going to just go through that one more time. It took me a long time to actually remember this and write it down how to do the alpha channel. This was a dodge layer, so I wrote that in the file name, which means it's not a screen blending mode. And so we'll go through that process one more time. It's likely your project had changed its settings back to the original settings. I'm going to go length 30 frames, size, make sure it's the same as image 1. Now when I go to export it, image sequence, export 32-bit image. That's important for getting the alpha channel. Find the sunflower layer in the project here. Okay, so we're back in the project here. And I don't like it. I don't like how that sunflower is moving. It could definitely be slowed down. It's all right. Let's edit that and come back here. So here we are back in the animation, and for that back sunflower radial, I actually just ended up rotating it. It was the more simple of the animation, and it does look good back there. You can see that there's this other rippling design behind it, so now I'm going to play with animating that, which might end up going in an opposite direction. We'll see. It's these kind of swirling, I'm going to zoom in here so you can see it a bit better. They kind of have this like spiral shape to them. And then there's another one that's sort of like an aura around the deer, so one of them's for the sun. And I didn't actually do a lot of key points or markers on this one, and it works out just fine. I chose one radial, especially on this one where it's a bit tighter, where I dropped a node about every fourth ripple here, and then did some kind of larger ones on the exterior, and then some, just you can see in the center here where there's just 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, just so that when all I did was grab all of them and then rotated it slightly. And so it's working out pretty well. So there are shapes where you can do such a thing, and you can see it's working out pretty good. All right, so what we got here is another example of a sort of more organic layer, not so much pattern going on. These are sort of like little glowing orbs. And how I'm going to do that in this project, kind of similar to the smoke, but yeah, it'll have a moderate amount of control. There's like a controlled randomness to it, just so that for this one, they're not necessarily moving all totally in the same direction, but it's kind of one of those things, again, once it's in the full animation, the full sequence, the stack of layers, it's kind of hard to tell. So let's see what this looks like. All right, so you can see how that's looking. It does still have a pretty uniform look to it, but this is also the type of thing where I might add some other effects layers on top, like actually bring in a particle generator and sort of accentuate what's going on with these things with some other effects layers. And here we are back in the project. If you look around, you can see some of the orbs, some around the mushrooms here. On the top here, they look like they're moving pretty fast, but I think that's all right for this feature. Again, there's some around above the spring here too, the little waterfall. Because of the different durations of some of these movements, I feel like it's all right to have that kind of effect. Some of them just moving faster than others, just so that they're more noticeable. And we'll see what it looks like once I get to some other composites. Might slow that down, but anyway, that's what it looks like with the glowing orbs. All right, so now that we've got all the layers added, I'm starting to get into some more effects and lengthening the loop. So I've already gone in and added some other layers, and maybe you can see this rippling that's coming. There's sort of this light ripple spreading out from the third eye of the deer and also on these ground radials. It's pretty subtle, but it's just a lightning effect. Kind of looks like it's spiraling. So I'm just going to go backwards now and show you how that was done and then do another variation of it. And some of these terms will make more sense if you're familiar with After Effects. This isn't really a beginner After Effects tutorial, so I'm not going to break down each and every step. But it'll make sense if you understand After Effects. So in my composition panel here, you can see down below that I've created a 4-second loop, which is doubling the initial 2-second loop that just starts with the basic layers. And for this one, I took out some of these sort of spiky radials that are around coming out from the third eye of the deer, because I wanted to accentuate them with this rippling effect so that they're a bit more subtle to begin with, and then as the ripple comes out, they start to lighten up. So what I had to do then is make a loop out of those features, and I made that into a composition so that I could then use it as a track mat. And so some of them were basically a 1-second loop, and some of them here were 60 frames per second, almost 2-second loops. Now when I go back into this composition, I'm not seeing that layer, but what I've done is created something else. So if I just solo it out here, and if I turn off the track mat, you can actually just see this is all that's happening. It's really just a solid layer that goes out like that. Pretty simple, pretty basic effect. And so what I'll do is turn that back on, and now it's using this composition that is these spike radials as a track mat, as a luma mat. And then if I take those off, we can see how it looks. And then I eventually did actually bring back in those spike radials just so that they're showing a little bit to begin with in this 4-second loop. And essentially that's the same thing happening with this ground radial. So if I turn, so you can see there it's spreading out from the deer, and it just has some softened edges. And if I, again, were to turn off the track mat, you can see that I just picked a solid layer, and then I also have it on an add effect. So it is using this ground radial composition here as the luma mat. And then in this composition, you can see it looks like that. and then it's composed over everything else so that it adds kind of a glowing effect. Now I did keep the original radials there because I like how they look. And I also just had to mask out a little bit of the snout here kind of on the deer because it was added on top, so I just had to mask that out. If I zoom in, you can see that little mask there. Okay, so now what I'm going to try and do is just show you, just recreate that, and I'm going to do it for one more of the layers, which is these sort of purple flares coming out. So I'm going to go back into the original composition here and grab those. All right, so now you can see I have this layer. It's a flat layer. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to duplicate this other radial effect that's already happening on the spikes radial. Maybe I'll just change the color here so that I can differentiate it. And instead of using the spike radial composition as a track matte, I'm going to use this one that's called, well, let me change the name, it's just spelled wrong, Vortex Flat Paint Layer. Okay, so I'm going to solo this out and just see if I even need to do anything to it. So you can kind of see it's pretty subtle, but it's doing the same thing as the other one. So now with that there, let's see what it looks like in the main composition. Yeah, so essentially it's just adding another subtle layer to it. It doesn't really need to be a whole lot more than that. Now what I could do also to accentuate that is I could go into this second version of the original stack and take this right out and see what happens. I'm curious to see what that looks like. And it might just make it look even more prominent as the glow is coming around. So it's a little too subtle. So there are various ways I could fix that. I could boost up the opacity a lot sooner. I could start off with, I could bring that down here, copy this keyframe so that it's happening, so that it gets bright a bit earlier. I don't mind that either. But I think what I'll do is I will keep this on, and I might just turn down the opacity on this one a little bit so that it's still there, but then this is actually, because this has an add effect, it is actually adding to it, to what's already there. So let's see what that looks like. Great, yeah, I think I like that. So now we can see that it's all flowing together. And what I like about it is even though this initial circle, I didn't change the angle of it to contour the angle of these radials coming off the third eye of the deer. It was just a flat circle, but it actually to me looks like it's kind of spiraling with this shape. Maybe you can see that. So sometimes those are sort of just little happy accidents that work out that way. Okay, so one more look at this. I added a couple more layers. We've got the antlers glowing at the same rate as well, so I isolated those in Photoshop, brought it in as a transparency, and applied the same effect with the other radial layers. And then I also added just a bit of a glow to the body of the deer as the radial is going around, and that's just a deep glow effect. There's nothing going on with the same radials. And you might have wondered why I didn't just create one composition, because there's the same radial that is being used, this one here that's being used for multiple layers. Why I didn't just create a composition and track matte that, and that's because some of the layers that it's going on are different. Some are flattened with a black background, some have a transparency, so some are alpha matte and some are luma matte, and this way I just have more control over it, and if I wanted to do subtle changes to each, then I could. So now we're going to look at bringing this into an even longer loop, an 8-second loop in composition. So what I'll do typically when I get to this stage, and even the 2-second stage before I bring it longer, is I will render out a version, an image sequence at the highest resolution of this loop and see if it works for the other compositions so that it doesn't have to load as I'm trying to create the longer one. And now here we are in the 8-second loop. So what I've done is taken the 4-second loop, stacked it a couple times, made the composition a bit longer just in case I wanted to play with that, but decided to keep it around 8 seconds. And ultimately it's pretty similar, but what I wanted to do is have a version where it gets all of the auras on the trees and everything get brighter. So you can kind of see it goes through one pulse, and then on the second one, everything gets brighter. So I'll just go back and forth, and it just boom. And then it goes back, and so it just loops in that. So if I open up what the auras look like here, this is it. I just chose specific layers and looped them. And then all I did in the 8-second stack was that. So this is what the completed piece looks like at regular speed. I ended up adding a bit of a, so there is a subtle pulse that goes the same as the radials around the deer coming out from the sort of sun in the center there, but it's a bit more subtle. And then also on this 8-second loop, these Amanita mushrooms down here also glow. So it's all the sort of geometrical auras and then the mushrooms. And that's a wrap on this one. I think I'll do another tutorial where I go from a very base layer image that has absolutely no psychedelic components, because this image actually started off as a forest with no deer and it was all browns and greens. And so it'll be interesting to see that animate, but that's for another time. Thanks for tuning into this one, and I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think, and let me know if you have any questions. If you found this useful, please consider a donation on YouTube or wherever this is listed. Your support is greatly appreciated.